Cool, we're back. I'm getting much better at this. The key I just learned is not to type the instructions on these floating screens in front of me until the end, so you don't know what we're talking about, but you're here and hopefully you didn't leave, so I thoroughly appreciate all of you folks coming back for part two. Tim, so nice to have you back. Appreciate it, brother. And everybody else popping in, seeing the folks coming in. I'm glad you guys followed instructions and continue to join me for Day Drinking with Wes Hagen. It is the 15th of July. We missed Bastille Day by one day, so all you French revolutionaries, happy post-Bastille Day. This would probably be the day that if you did storm the Bastille on the 15th, you were either in serious trouble or you were feeling seriously stoked about it. So congratulations on the 14th. Way back in the 19th century, all those weapons collected to make sure that the French equality was guaranteed. So welcome, welcome. We talked a little bit about Chardonnay. In my glass is the 2018 J.Wilkes Chardonnay. It's tasting cool and delicious on this rather cool but temperate summer day here in Santa Maria. I was mentioning we didn't really get over 74 degrees today, so lovely day in the fog. Fog broke and we got some beautiful sunshine. The vines are absorbing. Remember what we talked about last week, that the maximum photosynthetic capacity for a grapevine is 87 degrees. So if we hit 87, or any vineyard in the world hits 87 degrees, or which is about 27 degrees Celsius, at about 87 degrees, that is when grapevines are hitting on every single cylinder for photosynthesis. And you're basically getting maximum sugar accumulation in the fruit. Or if you are before fruit ripening cycle, still in a vegetative growth cycle in the vineyard, you would be getting sometimes 2, 3, 4 inches of growth on each shoot during that event. So, and 102 degrees is the moment where grapevines completely shut down. When grapevines go under maybe 50 degrees, they also start thinking about stomatal closure, closing the little sort of vents called stomata on the back of the leaves, and those open to allow water vapor to escape as a byproduct of photosynthesis. So at over 102 or under 48 or so, those stomata close, and they basically stop producing sugar or carbohydrate. To protect themselves from basically desiccating and dying as a result of losing all their water. So that's a little cool aside. But today, what we want to really talk about is environment versus the human intervention. So I want to talk a little bit about, so many times, guys, so many times. Tell me how many times you've heard this, that wine is made in the vineyard, right? Well, okay, so you're saying wine is, to a certain extent, made by forces beyond human control, and I completely disagree. Any commentary, any conversation about terroir or even typicity that ignores the human influence on wine and winemaking, I think is not only misguided but disingenuous. If you want to talk about pure terroir outside of human influence, you better be eating a mud pie, and I don't mean a big, cool chocolate dessert. I'm talking about just a plate with dirt on it, because you could eat the dirt, and that's as close to, terroir without human influence. Because if wine is made in the vineyard, vineyards do not exist in nature. Grapevines are an arboreal parasite. A grapevine grows up a tree, steals a tree's light, uses the tree's light up in the canopy to absorb the sunlight to produce, after many years, to produce fruit, to attract animals, to get to eat the fruit because it's sweet and delicious, and then carry the seeds in their gut and disperse the seeds. That's the job of a grapevine. A grapevine is a bird feeder. A grapevine is a seed dispersal mechanism. Grapevine's only job is to grow tall enough in a tree to absorb enough light to get the fruit sweet enough and dark enough to attract the eye of a bird or some other predator to come in, or something to eat the fruit, move the seed, because obviously grapevines cannot walk, nor can the seeds fly like some seeds can. So that's the whole plan of a grapevine, is to make sure it produces sugar to attract animals to disperse the seeds. But what I'm saying is vineyards don't exist in nature. So if wine is made in a vineyard, who planted the vineyard? A human. So you can't exclude human influence from terroir. You cannot exclude human influence from winemaking. If you say you're a non-interventionist winemaker, let's debate, because there's only two products that a non-interventionist winemaker can make. One would be vinegar, and the other would be raisins. Because if you leave grapes to their own devices, you're either going to get raisins or vinegar. Those are the only two options. Those are the result of what the Romans called the wine disease. Wine, like anything in nature, as it goes through entropy, it goes towards its most stable molecular state. And the most stable molecular state of wine is acetic acid, vinegar, right? By acetobacter, put in the wine, usually by an insect vector, slowly turns the wine from wine, produces some volatile acidity to ethyl acetate basically to acetic acid. That's an incredibly simplified version of what happens, but that is exactly how wine denatures and becomes vinegar. All right. We do move a little bit faster than we used to, but I'm always interested in where you are and what you're drinking. And I am watching you guys come in. So thank you guys so much for that. So really, there's nothing I can conceive as a winemaker, as a craft, or a science that's not influenced by both environment and human cultural practice. So let's talk a little bit about the vineyard first. What is purely environmental in a wine? Soil. More sand, less water holding capacity, more clay, more water holding capacity, and higher vigor vines. So you're going to probably get smaller clusters, smaller berries in a sandy vineyard, and you're going to get probably a little more color and verve in a sandy vineyard, and you're going to probably get in a higher clay soil. You're going to get higher yield, bigger grapes. Clay loam and sandy loam both make some amazing soils. And then, of course, you're going to get aspect, basically what side of the hill. In France, and a lot of people go to France and see that those southwest-facing hillsides, get all the attention. They get the Grand Crus, and they get the first growths, and following the Cormigian deposit, all that stuff. The aspect, though, in the New World doesn't really matter. Aspect in the Old World used to be if it's perfectly aligned so it captures the last bit of afternoon and evening sunlight, you can get an extra 1% of sugar by the end of the year, and that made all the difference. That made the difference between a $20 Village wine and a $2,000 a Grand Cru wine. Aspect was so important. Soil, of course, too. Sunshine, obviously aspect and sunshine go perfectly well, but the amount of sunshine in the environment in which you decide to plant a vineyard has a huge impact on ripeness. Obviously, Galileo said wine is sunlight held together by water, one of my favorite quotes. Wind, which way is the prevailing wind going to come? Which way you're going to run your rows? How's the wind going to hit the vines or go down the vine rows? That's going to have an impact. It's going to slow down the ripening, and theoretically, it's going to dry out the canopy and help you with your mildew and rot pressure and keep the fruit healthy. Wind is both good and bad. Too much wind, vine shuts down. Not enough wind, huge amounts of mildew and rot pressure because of the humidity that basically begins to sort of increase in the canopy where the fruit is, because all the fruit's surrounded by all the leaves. So we want to pull the leaves away, open up the canopy so wind and sun can move through the canopy, which keeps your mildew and rot pressure down. And imagine spraying your vineyard with fungicide. If all the fruit's covered with leaves, you're not going to get much coverage. If all the leaves are pulled away, you're going to get beautiful coverage and efficacy in your fungicidal spray program. Rainfall. Obviously, rain is really important. The natural habitat of Vitis vinifera would be Transcaucasia, between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. That area gets between 24 and 30 inches of rain historically. So I like to say I like 20 inches of rain for a dry farm vineyard. We get on average half of that here in Santa Maria Valley. So really Santa Maria, Santa Barbara County, not a really great area for growing dry farm grapes. So we're going to have to rely on irrigation, groundwater, another environmental part of that. The microbiome and the macrobiome. In the sense of the microbiome, all of the crazy stuff that's happening microbiologically, which is a huge part of what we're learning about the terroir of wine. The microbiome within the wine, within the fruit, within the vineyard is massively important. And we're finding more and more of the flavors of specific regions are actually due to the microbiome that we're finding within those regions. Macrobiome, I don't even know if there's a word, I just kind of made it up. What I mean is, the bunnies and the birds, your dogs, your sheep, your chickens, everything that lives on the farm chasing each other is the microbiome. The more things that are chasing each other, the less time they have to really hunker down and go after your vineyard, go after your fruit. So I always like to say at Clopepi that any animal is welcome in my vineyard, but if it starts eating the fruit, I do have more firearms to protect that vineyard than you'd probably suspect for a guy with hair like this. So yes, so it's very important to protect the macrobiome as long as it's successfully making good fruit. And if you have a sort of a little bit of when things get out of balance, then we have to put it back into balance to make sure we can continue growing crop, because that was my job. My job was to grow wine. I want everything to be happy on the property, but if they go after the vines, I'll scare them away. If they don't scare away, got to do what you got to do. So basically, let's talk just a little second about micro, macro, and macro, meso and macro climates. So there are 3 types of climates that are really described in wine literature. There's the macro climate, and I'm going to call the macro climate the region. Now, these are kind of new ways of describing this stuff. So realize that the definitions have changed. So when you hear them, you might, well, what was that? This is kind of what I learned, 15, 20 years ago at Davis, and I hope these things are still accurate. But I'm going to say macro climate is Santa Barbara County. Let's even go a little bit tighter. Let's go to AVA. So macroclimate, Santa Maria Valley AVA, Santa Rita Hills AVA, Ballard Canyon AVA. One single American viticulture is the macro. That's the whole region that we're talking about, looking at, discussing. We can make weather patterns, rainfall patterns, windfall patterns, and we can talk a little bit about the typicity of the style of wine that's made there. Then we go into the meso, the middle, the mesoclimate. The mesoclimate, I'm going to say, is the vineyard. So the mesoclimate in Santa Maria Valley would be Solomon Hills Vineyard. So we got macro, AVA, mesoclimate, vineyard, microclimate. You ready for this? I want microclimate to define one vine's fruit zone. One vine. So row 16, 82 vines in, the one on the right, just where the fruit is hanging, on usually the second and the fourth node. So if this is the wood that the shoot's coming out of, both clusters are always going to be within probably the first foot of the canopy. That's the fruit zone. That's where we pull leaves. That's where we do our canopy management to encourage sun and wind within that area. So I'm going to say if there, I think I figured out there was about, let's see, 1,240. There was about 60,000 vines, I think, at Clopepi. So there were 60,000 microclimates, because that's where the rubber meets the road. I don't care what the weather's like outside. I don't care what the weather's like in Santa Maria Valley. What is the most important thing, if you really think about it, is the climate at the place, the exact place where the fruit is ripening, because that's what's going to influence, as far as sun exposure on the cluster, the chemical structure, terpene production, pyrazine production. Canopy management is really where the rubber meets the road in fine wine production. So I'm going to say that that's the quick definition of macro, meso, and micro. And this all comes from Richard Smart's book, Sunlight into Wine, which really fundamentally changed the world of viticulture. And if you're interested in viticulture and you don't own Richard Smart's Sunlight into Wine, you should own it. It's absolutely killer. All right, so let's talk about, in the vineyard, human intervention. So accessibility, how close is it to the road? 80% of vineyards are planted today, maybe 90%, by virtue of how easy it is to get in and out, how close you can get to a restaurant, or people want access on major highways. So right now it's not like we're planting the best vineyards and the best properties. We're just planting the vineyards in the dirt that hasn't been used, that's adjacent to other places where we're selling wine and making money. So accessibility is human intervention. It may not be a great thing, because I think the best vineyard sites are probably off the beaten path in areas we haven't even found yet. So I think that's human intervention. Choice of property, exactly what I talked about. It's a human who's choosing the dirt that we're using, right? Local, regional laws, regulations, obviously are going to be very important. What you can plant, what you can't plant. That's not really happening in America, but obviously local regulations is going to be important. Can you farm? Can you apply fungicide? Can you apply pesticide? Is there an ag commissioner? What is the ag commissioner? How intense are they going to be about you following the regulations in your vineyard? Soil preparation, soil amendments. Believe it or not, most vineyards planted in California, we mess with the soil. We like you to think that our soils are perfect, but most vineyards, with modern vineyard managers would look at the pH of the soil, the calcium levels of the soil, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, NPK, try to figure out what the hell's going on. So you moderate the soils before we plant. So we would rip the soil, amend the soil, disc the soil, and then set up our trellising, put it in the water system, test it all. Last thing you do is you throw in the vines. Trellising materials have changed significantly in the last 30 or 40 years. We've moved from California sprawl, just a vine just kind of coming up and falling out like Cousin It's hair, or mine, or really the idea now, or quadrilaterals, or all these different stuff. And now really some of the most Santa Rita Hills is really planted on vertical shoot positioning, or VSP, where we're making curtains of foliage and encouraging the shoots by putting them in shoot positioning wires to form basically curtains of foliage. I like to call them solar panels for the production of booze. They absorb sunlight, they produce sugar. My job, turn the sugar into delicious wine that you guys can drink during the day on this show. Oh, what else? How about choosing your rootstock and your scion combo? What are you going to plant? What clone are you going to plant? What rootstock are you going to plant? What irrigation system? What's your water availability? All this is done before the vineyard is even planted. And then after the vineyard is planted, irrigation and nutrition of your young developing vineyard, or the irrigation and nutrition of a mature vineyard, pruning intensity and style, economic need for the crop to recover development cost, otherwise known as I need to make some money, so let's push a couple tons out of this vineyard right away. These are things that happen in real life. I'm not telling you about the romance of a vineyard. I'm talking about the reality of a vineyard. Practices in canopy management. So how are you going to manage your canopy? Very, very important to the quality of the wine. Labor, obviously, incredibly important, especially in California right now. The labor's expertise, training. What equipment are you going to use? What type of sprays? What type of chemicals? You've got determination of the level of sustainability. Are you going to go conventional, sustainable lowercase, sustainable uppercase? You're going to do organic. You're going to do biodynamic. What are you going to do, and why? How is it going to affect that wine? Your level of engagement and observation. How much are you getting into your own vineyard and checking out what's going on? Right. All this stuff is super important, and really important. How much do you know about wine? Because, dude, just because you want to grow wine and you want to make wine doesn't mean you have a good palate. Doesn't mean you don't. I mean, you can make. I want to make a chair. I could make a chair. It's going to be freaking ugly. It might hurt my butt, but I can still make a chair. Anyone can grow wine, anyone can make wine, but what I find is if you are a geek and you are driven and you are passionate and you have had those experiences, those seminal wine experiences that turn you on, like you heard about from Ken Brown on Friday. By the way, Jim Clendenin this Friday, 5 o'clock. If you missed that one, that's going to be a hoot. So really understanding wine and knowing what you want to produce and having the intelligence and the frame of reference to understand wine is absolutely important. How are you going to time the practices in the vineyard, your canopy management, your leaf pulling, your dropping of your crop, and the intensity of those practices, and finally, your harvest decisions. And then finally, the human influence of machinery. How are you going to use a machine to leaf, to weed, to shoot position, to machine? Are you going to use machine harvesting, spray rigs? All this stuff is incredibly important to understand, and really relying on machinery is incredibly important, especially in places like Australia that have very little amount of labor, and probably going to become more increasingly important in areas like California, as we're seeing our labor force in California being reduced by basically slowing immigration, fear of immigration laws, and also basically, I guess, other industries like cannabis starting to pick up a lot more workers that used to work in wine because they might be paying more than we are. Okay, so that gives you an idea of sort of environment versus human intervention in the vineyard. So let's quickly move over, because we're going a little bit slow, and talk a little bit more about the winery. So in the winery, the environment really has its own terroir. So barrels near the edges of the winery will complete primary malolactic fermentation a lot quicker than barrels in the middle of the winery, because the barrels in the middle of the winery are usually 1 or 2 degrees cooler. So that environment has a big impact on how wines age and move within the winery. folks regularly are very surprised at the difference between various barrels in different positions. How high the barrels are. Higher barrels will finish fermentation first. Lower barrels will finish a little bit later. So all that's important. So it's really difficult to separate environmental and human influences in the winery. A vine can exist without human influence, but a winery is a purely human invention. So, I mean, you can try to control the ambient temperature, but whatever city you live in, you know, I mean, if you're making wine in Paso and you want to keep your cellar at 58 degrees, and you live in Lompoc and you want to keep your cellar at 58 degrees, you can almost keep your cellar at 58 degrees in Lompoc with no temperature control, just air cooling. So all of these decisions really, really matter, and it's hard to like really understand. Like, so the human intervention maybe would be like choosing an area for your winery that has ambient temperature control, like Areni 1, one of the most ancient winery sites in the world, was inside a cave with an airlock. And that airlock within, you know, Armenia is not a cool place in the summer, but you can walk into this old, you know, 8,000-year-old wine or 5,000-year-old winery in Areni in Armenia, and basically go into the opening of the cave, take a left, take a right, and then all of a sudden be in 65, 70 degrees at max, perfect temperature, and wine has been made in that cave. We don't even know how long, because we've only gotten down to like 6,000 years, but we're going to probably expect it to really have that amazing thing. So, you know, to state of the art, the human intervention can make the temperature in your winery wherever you want. Jacketed tanks, you can basically heat or cool the liquid within the tanks in your winery if you have that capacity and that technology. That is huge. It has a huge impact on the speed of fermentation and also how the wine ages and keeping the wine absolutely sound. And then, of course, you know, the technology and the human intervention within the winery goes to technology, science, and the genius of human invention. Your press, your crusher, your forklift with your bin dumper, your sorting table, dry ice, filtration, chemical additives and preservatives like SO2. All this stuff is absolutely important. So, you know, as far as environment, wine makes itself, but then it's really up to the human beings to focus our attention on watching to make sure the good microbes are going the right way and the bad microbes basically are being told to they're not welcome within the winery. So really, I think there's much more that you can talk about between sort of natural environment and human intervention in the vineyard. Within the winery, I think we have much more control because, again, a winery is 100% human invented. Grapevines do actually exist in nature without humans, and we can look at some of the environmental influences that happen there. But when it comes down to actually human beings making the wine for human enjoyment and consumption, it gets a little crazier. That's it. A little bit about environment, terroir. Terroir versus human involvement. Never the two shall meet, and never the two shall be separate. I think obviously always the two shall meet. It would be a better way to say it, because really when you look at the terroir, it's nothing without a human, because again, dirt tastes like dirt. Grapevines do not make great wine by themselves, and they're just a system for enticing animals to spread their seeds. Cool. Thank you, Dead Linus. I hope all is well out in DC. Thanks to Amy and to Chef and everybody else that came along today. We had a nice group today. I really appreciate it. Yeah, indigenous yeast. I don't think there is indigenous yeast, Jim. That's a really good question. And I got a couple questions that I'll look real quick. So I would say that indigenous yeast is a nice thing to imagine, but really indigenous yeast I don't think exists. I think it's feral yeast. It's yeast that's basically escaped from wineries, that has stayed within the surfaces of a winery. Whatever is the most aggressive yeast you've ever used in your winery, that's probably what's finishing your wines. It's a great and novel and sort of romantic concept that, here comes, we have these yeasts that live in our vineyards and they make great wine, but it's true, some regions like Los Angeles has terrible yeast that floats around. Santa Barbara, we have some of the best indigenous feral yeast you can imagine. But I'll tell you what, if you've used a strain of Saccharomyces biennis in your winery, biennis will finish every wine you make from there on out, because once the yeast has been in there, it's basically going to be, I've used ubiquitous 3 times tonight, so I apologize. It's going to be everywhere. It's going to be everywhere. Nice. Should bins be rotated to have fermentation complete at the same time? You know, I'm finding when I have bins in the winery, generally their positions are generally all along one side of a wall, and they're equally sort of spread out through the winery and equally close. I have seen where, and you know what, we're constantly, you know, testing and pressing. I would say that the difference between 1.5 ton fermentation bins being in proximity throughout the winery, I would expect probably maybe a 1 Brix lag. And I have no problem because as we start dumping fermenters and putting that wine into barrel, the wine will be mixed up a little bit and put around. And if it's only 1 Brix, I'm not really worried too much about it. But theoretically, if I had way too much time on my hands and, you know, basically way too many interns and they needed, you know, idle hands being the devil's tool, yeah, I'd have interns move those fermenters around a little bit. But I do like fermenters to sort of be in a line so we can sort of, you know, put the plank of pane up there, do our ferments, move the plank, do another ferment, move it along, so we can kind of do that fairly efficiently. That's pretty cool. Glad you guys are all staying curious, staying educated. As always, find someone in your neighborhood, family, and maybe someone you don't know that might need some help during COVID. Ask them to if you can help them. Do everything you can to encourage everyone you know. I just read a study today that said maybe if 100% of Americans wore masks, we'd be out of this in 4 to 6 weeks. So let's do it. Let's just go ahead and do it. I also read in Bogota, Colombia, that the Cali cartel is actually shooting people not wearing masks. So yeah. So take that with a grain of salt. I hope you guys all had a good time day drinking. These always will be up on YouTube after the shows, usually a day or two afterwards. You can always check them out on IGTV. You can always check them out on Facebook Live, but you can also go over to youtube.com to J.Wilkes Wines or Miller Family Wines, a Miller Family Wine Company. Check out our videos over there, like, follow, and watch a couple of videos so my boss knows that these things are worth my time, and as well as you're learning something. So hope you guys all had a great time. Really appreciate it. And I will see you guys Friday with Jim Clendenin from Au Bon Climat. I can't wait. I just wrote all the questions for him today. These questions are going to be awesome. Just to give you an idea. First question. In previous interviews, you have discussed the evolution and improvement of Santa Maria Valley AVA vineyards since 1977 when you began working with them. You mentioned improved clonal material, genetic accessions, trellising, matching varietals to soil and climate, getting rid of the Bordeaux varietals and favoring Burgundian accessions, especially the Dijon clones. The question I have is complicated. Take me through the history of Santa Maria vineyards from your perspective and consider, does terroir evolve and mutate vis-a-vis technology and agricultural advancement? And at what point, if any, can terroir be said to reach a standard or equilibrium? So yeah, we're going geeky, and I can't wait. Jim is one of the few people on the planet that can make me feel dull when he's on, and I suspect it'll be a perfect time between lunch and dinner to get him in a moment where we're going to have some drinks, we're going to have some conversation, we're going to have some laughs, and we're going to learn a lot about Santa Maria wine. I hope you guys all learned. We'll see you guys on Friday, 5 o'clock for Jim Clendenin. Thanks a lot, guys, and keep on day drinking.